Guns are loud. They've been loud ever since the 1400s. And after 500 years of guns being really loud, H.P. Maxim developed the firearm silencer while he was working on automobile mufflers. Both inventions work exactly the same way. This can captures the expanding gases, and interior baffles slow them down so that they leave the muzzle much more gently and quietly. Well, not much more quietly. Even though I have a modern, efficient can on here, I still have to wear hearing protection. The only reason that we call this a silencer is because that's what's on the 1916 patent that Maxim got. So, even though I still have to wear hearing protection, there's less recoil, there's less blast, it's much quieter for the neighbors. Why doesn't everybody have suppressors? Well, the answer is that there are some significant legal hurdles that you have to jump if you want one. First of all, you have to fill out a significant amount of paperwork, provide the BATF with your photos, with your fingerprints, and then buy a $200 tax stamp. And then you can't even have your suppressor until the BATF has processed all of that paperwork, added you to a large national gun registry, and that usually takes them somewhere between 6 months to a year. At that point, it's easier to just move to New Zealand or France or Norway or any of the countries that treat suppressors as if they're just a normal over-the-counter item. Most European nations have far, far looser suppressor restrictions than we do here in the United States, even though they have extremely tight firearm restrictions. Which begs the question, how did we, freedom-loving Americans, allow this little metal tube to have exactly the same regulations as a machine gun? Let's go back to 1916, when General John Thompson began developing a small handheld machine gun for soldiers who were engaged in the brutal trench warfare of World War I. But by 1921, when his company Auto Ordnance finally put the Thompson submachine gun into production, World War I was over, and the finished product cost $200, which was outrageously expensive at the time. For context, pump-action shotguns and lever-action rifles cost $20 to $30, so it was very hard for them to find buyers, outside of Hollywood anyway.
Hey, Johnny, look what I got. Look at Johnny, you can carry it around like a baby.
The Tommy gun became ubiquitous on the silver screen. Gangster movies ruled the box office, and the Chicago typewriter ruled movie gangsters.
There's only one thing that gets orders and gives orders, and this is it.
In almost every film, cops and crooks engaged in long, drawn-out machine gun battles that wiped out almost entire neighborhoods. But in real life, the Thompson was just barely selling. 15,000 Thompsons had been made in 1921, and Auto Ordnance didn't sell through that stock until World War II was heating up, almost 2 decades later. But let's get back to the 20s, when movies were defined by the Tommy gun, and real life was defined by Prohibition. An entire decade of the federal government doubling down on bad laws that hurt private citizens and helped criminals.
It's not a question of whether or not it's a harmless drink. It may very well be, but it's against the law, gentlemen. And as we are going to enforce the law, we must do first by example.
The war on booze helped criminals like Al Capone get so incredibly wealthy that his goons could actually afford Thompson submachine guns, and some of his gang definitely used them to commit crimes. Incredibly infamous crimes like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where they killed 7 members of a rival Chicago gang. And the Depression-era gangs that came after Prohibition were even more sensational. John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, they all used automatic weapons to rob banks in the 30s. Well, not Pretty Boy Floyd, but they still sold hundreds of thousands of papers. The public loved and hated them, and the government decided that they had to do something. In April of 1934, FDR's Attorney General brought the National Firearms Act before Congress and urged its immediate passage. It was a drastic bill that claimed that it would prevent criminals from having or using dangerous guns. But of course, it was just a mess of red tape, oversight, and taxes that criminals would ignore, officials would misuse, and regular citizens would fear.
That's the Chicago way.
For context, FDR's administration was creating new government agencies right and left at this point, and radically expanding the scope and authority of existing agencies, especially the Department of Justice. His Attorney General, Homer Cummings, had this gigantic vision for transforming the entire federal government. Fortunately, he was not able to get everything on his 12-point program accomplished, but his National Firearm Act did pass, and it added regulations to machine guns, sawed-off shotguns, short-barreled rifles, and silencers. It's a very short bill, but the discussion of that in the Congressional Committee is very interesting, and I'm linking to the transcript below so that you can read it for yourself. It actually sounds really familiar. There's 4 points in particular that remind me of modern gun control efforts. First, a false sense of urgency driven by media, misinformation, and horrific fringe cases. In this case, the murders committed by the Barrow Gang and the Dillinger Gang. But in 1934, those gangs have already committed murder and are actively being hunted by lawmen that have shoot-to-kill orders.
There is only one way to deal with such men, and that is hunt them down.
This bill to make them more criminal had no effect on those cases whatsoever. And even if it had been passed years before, it still would have had no effect, since Dillinger stole his Thompson submachine guns from a police station, and Barrow stole his Browning automatic rifles from a National Guard armory. But because those gangs were in the papers in the spring, new gun laws have to get pushed in the spring. And that resulted in some very hastily constructed legislation that was being very, very rushed at the time. Which brings me to the second point. Legislation which is enacted by technically ignorant legislators. The original bill, as brought by the Department of Justice, is a train wreck of firearm ignorance. For example, the bill's original definition of a machine gun is any gun that is fully automatic or semi-automatic that can hold more than 12 rounds. That's every gun on the table except for this one. None of the legislators questioned that language at all, but fortunately there were a few experts there to give testimony, and they caught some of those things. Now, to be fair, some of those legislators were born during the Civil War, but today's politicians have no excuse for not understanding basic 20th century weapons technology.
Well, if it can fire a lot of bullets very quickly, that's a good place to start, okay?
And hunters
then you
would
can
say,
argue what a lot is. Okay, let's pick it. Let's say 3.
This right here has ability with a .30 caliber clip to disperse with 30 bullets within half a second.
Pistols are different. You have to pull the trigger each time. An assault weapon, you basically hold it, goes blah, blah, blah.
No, those are fully automatic weapons.
Okay.
The third thing the bill does is it removes rights on false pretenses and unproven associations. For example, the Attorney General estimates that there are 500,000 armed criminals in the U.S., which, I don't know, maybe that was a good guess. But he does so while talking about the Thompson submachine gun, and he implies that gangsters are predominantly armed with Thompson submachine guns.
Have a look at that Thompson submachine gun. One up top there with a custom pistol grip.
Then he talks at length about how incredibly prevalent machine guns are among this vast criminal group. But then he points out that only one company actually makes machine guns, and there haven't been very many sales, so it's not going to inconvenience very many voters, I mean citizens, to restrict them. Also, this bill groups weapons together with no good definitions or reasons. For example, because some gangsters have murdered each other with sawed-off shotguns, the Department of Justice assumes that short-barreled rifles are equally likely to be used in crimes.
Brings a knife to a gunfight.
And because short shotguns have been used in crimes, they can't have legitimate uses? Which reminds me, we were talking about silencers. The legislators do not talk about silencers at all. There is no justification for including silencers on the list whatsoever. Now, I'd always read that the reason for silencer restrictions was poaching. During the Great Depression, people were literally starving, and so presumably the amount of out-of-season hunting had gone up.
The bastard was poaching deer.
Poaching? Is it not a greater crime to starve a family?
So it's generally accepted today that silencers were added to the NFA to stop poor folks from eating the king's deer. But Congress never discusses this at all. In fact, the only time they even mention silencers is when they read the part of the bill that mentions restricting silencers. The Department of Justice does not talk about how they've been used in crimes or how they work or what they do or what they might do or anything. It's just assumed that they should be lumped in with everything else and banned. Not banned, of course, just regulated, because the fourth thing that this bill does is sidestep the Constitution and the Second Amendment with some sketchy loopholes. This the legislators did discuss, and the Attorney General did admit, when pressed, that a gun ban would be absolutely unconstitutional. But this is not a ban, this is just regulation. So all you have to do is send in all your personal information, 2 sets of photos, and fingerprints, get written permission from your chief of police or your sheriff, wait for the federal government to add you and your purchase to a large, massive, permanent gun database, and then, of course, buy that $200 tax stamp. Now, It should be noted that the justification for that $200 tax is that the Thompson cost $200. That number is set by the worst-selling, most expensive, most statistically irrelevant gun on the market, because machine guns.
Yeah, I'd like to have a look at that Thompson submachine gun.
And remember that in 1934, that $200 is about $3,870 in 2019 money. This was not some small fee to help the feds pay for this big national gun registry, but a gigantic barrier to entry. A deliberately huge obstacle for anybody wanting any of the items on the NFA list. This is the very middle of the Great Depression. The Department of Justice has the audacity to suggest that a $200 tax on a $20 shotgun, that's a 1,000% tax, somehow is not going to infringe on anybody's rights to keep and bear arms. Somehow a tax amounting to nearly a month's wages is not going to prevent law-abiding citizens from buying the tools that they need to defend themselves from, I don't know, 500,000 gangsters. And ironically, the gangsters that started this machine gun panic, which produced this bill, were some of the very few Americans who could actually afford to pay this tax. One Tommy gun plus one tax stamp was about the cost of a brand new car, which was nothing to Al Capone.
You're here because you got nothing. You don't got a thing. You got nothing. Nothing!
And remember, this tax is supposedly being levied to prevent criminals from getting guns, because if the Department of Justice has learned anything from Capone, it's that gangsters are really, really good at following tax laws.
Try a murder for not paying his taxes?
Oh, it's better than nothing.
But it's actually much worse. The original version of the National Firearms Act was written to regulate all handguns with the exact same restrictions as machine guns. At this point in the discussion, this tax is not just for incredibly rare weapons. It is for every single firearm on the market that is not a long-barreled rifle or a long-barreled shotgun.
All of them? Yes, sir.
We're talking about a $200 tax on a $5 revolver. And fortunately, that was a bridge too far for many of the legislators. They could see that this gigantic tax was ridiculously restrictive to the average citizen, and the idea of keeping people from getting the most common and most useful self-defense weapons, especially during a crime wave, would cost them a lot of votes, and possibly citizens. So they removed handguns from the list, but everything else stayed, and in June of 1934, the NFA became law. Because machine guns.
Yeah, I'd like to have a look at that Thompson submachine gun. And 2 of them drums.
Fast forward 85 years until today. The NFA is still on the books with a few minor changes over the decades, and it has definitely discouraged law-abiding citizens from buying the items that are on the list. But less so over time, since the American dollar has been significantly devalued. Today, that $200 tax stamp is, if I do the math right, only $200 in 2019 money. Adding that to a $400 suppressor is a little less financially debilitating. And so, BATF reports show that the purchases and registration of silencers has been on a pretty rapid increase over the last decade. I'm guessing there's at least 1.5 million NFA registered suppressors on the books at the moment. For context, that means that there's more cans in America than electric cars. And they're louder, and they kill fewer people. The BATF has pursued an average of 44 silencer crimes per year for the last decade, and most of those are registration violations, not shootings. Even if all of those alleged crimes have been convictions, which the majority haven't been, and even if they all involved an NFA-registered silencer, which the majority don't, the conviction rate for silencer crimes would still be 0.003%. For context, 10 of our last 955 federal legislators have been convicted of felonies, so that's a conviction rate of almost 1%. Silencer owners are one of the most law-abiding demographics in the world, and silencers themselves are almost never involved in crimes. Even the BATF noticed this, and in early 2017, the Associate Deputy Director Ronald Turk urged Congress to deregulate silencers because they incur a considerable amount of paperwork and are, quote, very rarely used in criminal shootings, unquote. Republican legislators prepared the Hearing Protection Act to deregulate them, but then, in late 2017, a gunman murdered 58 people on the Vegas Strip. And the Republicans suddenly pretended like they'd never heard of the Hearing Protection Act. The shooter did not own or use a silencer, but that was still the end of the discussion on deregulating suppressors. Now, just a few weeks ago, a disgruntled city employee murdered 12 of his colleagues in their Virginia Beach building. Details on this shooting and the shooter are extremely sparse, but he allegedly had a silencer on one of his 2 guns. The official BATF report has not mentioned it, but the local police chief did. If there was a silencer, it was already banned in that entire city, also in that building. But never mind. Bob Menendez, the senior senator from New Jersey, has already introduced a bill that would ban suppressors nationwide. Oh, by the way, Bob Menendez is not one of the felons. I don't mean to imply that at all. The Department of Justice has dropped all the charges of fraud and bribery that he was indicted on, so not a criminal. He can keep making laws. Let's just focus on his bill. It's not a regulatory bill. It's an actual ban, plus a giant tax bill to cover the buyback and confiscation of almost all of those 1.5 million legally registered suppressors. I think cops and former cops could probably keep theirs, but it's not a very well thought out or well written bill. It's just being pushed fast and hard right now while Virginia Beach is still in the headlines. And remember how 1920s Hollywood made America believe that gangsters and G-men were just constantly shooting up neighborhoods with their infinite Tommy guns? In the same way, modern Hollywood has made America believe that silencers are silent, perfect for stealthy shootings in public places.
Pretty public place.
Meaning?
Meaning, silencer would be handy.
According to the movie, silencers are so stealthy that you can have a full-on gunfight in a crowd without anybody even noticing. In reality, guns are really, really loud, and suppressors only bring them down to really loud. Out of all these very effective cans, this right here is the only one that I would ever use without hearing protection. That's .22 long rifle. It's already pretty quiet without the can because there is so little propellant inside of this bullet. It's the classic assassin gun, but I'd only use it for assassinating rabbits. Everything else on this table is really loud, like jackhammer loud. And a jackhammer is not exactly a good stealth ninja assassin weapon. Also, when the can captures most of the blast, it also captures most of the heat. And it gets very, very hot very fast. Hot enough to scorch and burn, which is not great for an assassin on the move. And ultimately, very few gun crimes actually benefit from being slightly quieter, as demonstrated by the fact that silencer crime is so incredibly rare. And don't tell anyone this, but DIY silencers are cheaper and easier to get than even Hollywood thinks, and criminals still almost never use them. But I guess legislators would rather watch movies than read crime reports, and Hollywood has made the silencer a magical tool of movie murderers for decades.
Hey, Harry, look at this. What's the matter with these cans? These cans are defective.
Doesn't matter what the actual statistics are, doesn't matter what reality is, doesn't matter that a deputy director of the BATF recommended deregulating silencers. One single event with an alleged suppressor can validate hundreds of fictional stereotypes and create a national emergency.
There's just been another massacre in Virginia Beach where the shooter used a silencer.
Yeah.
What is your view of silencers? Would you like to see those banned?
Well, I'd like to think about it. I mean, nobody's talked about silencers very much. They did talk about the bump stock, and we had it banned.
President Trump's administration has already stopped the Supreme Court from considering an important case on suppressor ownership. Kettler versus the United States had been appealed to the Supreme Court and was on its way to being heard this month when the Department of Justice sent a letter making the case that the Second Amendment does not protect silencers. So don't even hear the case.
I don't want to talk about this again.
The reasons were primarily two preceding cases, United States versus Miller and District of Columbia versus Heller. U.S. Miller was a 1939 case involving short-barreled shotguns. The Supreme Court did uphold and affirm the right to keep and bear arms could not be infringed by the government, period. And they further recognized that the entire purpose of the Second Amendment is to make sure that citizens, militias will have the military arms necessary to resist invasion and tyranny. However, they ruled that it's totally okay to infringe on the ownership of short-barreled shotguns because the Second Amendment only protects military weapons, and since no militaries of the time were using short-barreled shotguns, they're not a military item and thus not protected by the Second Amendment. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but since suppressors are heavily used by many militaries, wouldn't a logical application of U.S. v. Miller mean that suppressors are protected by the Second Amendment? Then there's D.C. versus Heller, which also affirms the Second Amendment, but then states that the Second Amendment does not protect weapons not typically possessed by law-abiding citizens for law-abiding purposes. I don't recall seeing that caveat in the actual Bill of Rights, but anyhow, there's a whole bunch of suppressors possessed by military guys, plus another 1.5 million possessed by law-abiding citizens. And according to the BATF, 99.997% of the time, it's for lawful purposes. How many million suppressors do we the people need to own before they become typical? And with only 44 crimes per year, how are lawful purposes not typical? And remember, very, very few of those 44 prosecuted crimes are violence with silencer. Lots of them are just bad guy caught with unregistered silencer, or in the case of Kettler versus U.S., good guy arrested with unregistered silencer after paperwork misunderstanding.
I knew it. I'm in trouble.
Big trouble. Up to 15 years in prison trouble. How many of these alleged 44 crimes per year are paperwork mistakes that get good guys thrown in prison? We don't know, but we know that when it does happen, it's because 85 years ago, the Department of Justice added suppressors to the NFA with no justification whatsoever. And today, the fact that the NFA still gets innocent men classified as criminals is cited as a justification to keep it on the books. Does that sound familiar?
It's not a question of whether or not it's a harmless drink. It may very well be, but it's against the law, gentlemen.
Most of these silencers are crimes in the same way that Prohibition suddenly defined about 50% of Americans as criminals.
Became an outlaw like you.
But at least the government recognized that Prohibition had been a mistake. After 13 years of increased drinking, increased murder, increased taxes, skyrocketing corruption, incredible hypocrisy, and oh yeah, 10,000 deaths caused by deliberate federal poisoning efforts.
You been to Chicago? Was it wonderful?
No.
So Prohibition was ended. The NFA, on the other hand, apparently cannot be rescinded or even questioned by the courts. Because, regardless of reality, politicians just don't like cans.
I don't love the idea of it. I don't like the idea of what's happening.
He hates these cans! Stay away from the cans!
Why? Why do our politicians seem hell-bent on demonizing silencers right now? I think H.L. Mencken figured it out. He lived through the 1920s and he had a front row seat to the entire Prohibition debacle, and he wrote that the entire aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary.
But if you let yourself be too scared, then you let the bad guys take over the country, don't you? Yeah. Then everybody gets scared.
Now let's be honest, suppressors can make criminals more deadly. There absolutely are certain situations in which a slightly quieter weapon would give a murderer an advantage. And putting a can on a firearm reduces the recoil and makes the weapon more comfortable to shoot. It makes the gun more controllable, which criminals would benefit from, but only because everybody benefits from this. When SWAT teams breach houses with explosives and then they run in with their suppressed weapons, the cans are not for stealth. They make it easier for the cops to control their weapons and use them safely and maintain situational awareness in those enclosed spaces or darkness and communicate with each other better and just be more effective in their work. It's not just about quiet. And if you want quiet, there's already a perfectly legal, silent projectile weapon that's been killing people for thousands of years. There's a whole bunch of upside to letting private citizens have suppressors. In a home defense situation, I want some of the same advantages that the SWAT guys want. And when you're on the range, they're great. They're not hearing safe, but they're far less damaging. I have to wear hearing protection to shoot these, but the people sitting over there don't have to. And things are much quieter for the neighbors. This thing even captures a bunch of carbon fiber and lead so that it can be disposed of properly. Everybody benefits. And there's a lot of upsides to letting private companies develop suppressors for a wider market. This is the CGS Siren, a 22 suppressor that is made out of carbon fiber with aluminum baffles. This is a very specialized new carbon weave and resin that makes it incredibly light, and it handles heat incredibly well. Also, it doesn't have the same resonance as a metallic can, which is cool. It's only in the last few years that the market for cans has grown enough to support some new R&D, like 3D printers making things out of titanium, or new materials from the aerospace industry like Inconel. But it's happening in very small and very slow steps, partly because the market is forcibly kept small, and partly because it takes so incredibly long to actually get your own can. Would you buy a cutting-edge piece of tech like this if you knew that you couldn't have it for 6 months or a year?
I'm just waiting for you.
The NFA tax and the BATF waiting list put a big damper on research and development that could benefit not just suppressors, but could help bring new manufacturing technologies and new material sciences to a whole bunch of new areas. Scientific progress and technical achievement are always driven by cross-pollination and overlap. When someone takes a piece of tech from one area and brings it over to another area or to a wider market, or mixes two inventions together. Remember that the original Maxim silencer was invented in conjunction with car mufflers, and Maxim's research on these two separate products benefited each other. And this is the Maxim 9. It's a silencer co-product, which is a pistol and suppressor that have been designed around one another. This is a very interesting platform. It could be the stepping stone to the handgun of the future, but it was also an incredibly expensive and risky move that at this point is just as likely to kill Silencer Co. as a company. The small businesses that make cans today have gone out on a limb to bring innovations to this 100-year-old invention, and it's frustrating to have all of this research and experimentation in high-tech materials or fluid dynamic innovations just being artificially limited by completely arbitrary rules and regulation.
It's difficult to accept this.
But the real impact of these arbitrary rules is far more sinister. When politicians debate silencers and they do this hypothetical cost-benefit analysis where an unknown percentage of criminals have slightly quieter weapons, and does that outweigh the unknown percentage of gun owners that have hearing loss, that completely misses the point. This conflict or argument is not about imaginary assassins having magic weapons versus firearm hobbyists having fun toys. It's about control. And before you say, think of the children, let me tell you, I'm not making this video because I just got a new suppressor. I'm making this video because my wife and I just had our third child. And we only had to wait 9 months, which is faster than a lot of the BATF paperwork. But we are very much thinking about our children and about protecting our children's future. The real cost-benefit analysis is this. Do we want our kids to live in a world where criminals might find it easier to obtain suppressors, or in a world where the government will arbitrarily punish law-abiding citizens for having them? Where our representatives increase the power of the state and decrease the power of their constituents on a whim? Where freedoms get randomly and erratically banned because politicians just personally don't like them?
It's already been decided in Washington.
And remember that we're not talking about a weapon, we're talking about an accessory, specifically the accessory that has been used in fewer crimes than any other firearm accessory in the history of gunpowder. We're talking about banning the accessory that offers the least useful benefit to violent criminals and a significant health benefit to lawful users. We're talking about a ban that will inconvenience the most law-abiding group of people in the country and have no effect on actual murderers whatsoever. And more importantly, both this potential ban and the current NFA restrictions set a bad legal precedent. These restrictions do significant damage to our nation's attitude toward the Second Amendment. Here at T.Rex Arms, we agree with the underlying presupposition of U.S. versus Miller. The Second Amendment is all about giving military capacity to individual private citizens. We agree with our nation's founders, who firmly believe that all men are endowed by their Creator with rights and responsibilities. The right to self-defense is undeniable. The responsibility to protect yourself, your family, and your country is non-negotiable.
A patriot must always be ready to defend his country against its government.
Now, this little metal tube doesn't actually have a very big effect on the protection of the nation, but laws that ban this little metal tube sure do. In 1934, Congress was very cautious about violating the Second Amendment, and they looked for an end run around it. Today, its members are perfectly willing to throw out the entire Bill of Rights that they have sworn to uphold. We need to hold them to their oaths of office. The good news is that it's not the 20s anymore. It's not the 1920s anymore. We don't have to be educated by Hollywood anymore. We don't have to wait for the newspapers to tell us what's going on. We don't have to let our elected officials tell us what to think. We have more access to data, more access to truth, and a greater ability to proclaim the truth, even in long, boring videos like this one. We can push back against lies, quislings, and traitors, and we have to. We have to push back against efforts to hobble, cripple, and diminish the power and freedom of the people. Otherwise, it will be the 1920s again. The worst parts of the 1920s all over again.
Here ends the lesson.
Alright, that's enough Kevin Costner for forever. This video focused on the legal and historical side of suppressors, but keep an eye out for a future video where we're going to talk about more practical stuff.
Yeah, so one thing that we'd like to do is produce a video or video series detailing every 5.56 can, or at least the main ones on the market, and talking about the muzzle devices as well. So we're going to be purchasing those, testing them, shooting a lot of rounds, and not just shooting them for one day, but actually running them through the paces, thousands of rounds, and doing some proper testing, at least better testing, better reviews of those cans, and then talking about some of the other things, considerations for suppressors as well. So that's what we hope to do in the future.
Absolutely. Keep an eye out for that, and thanks for watching.